Hello, and welcome to my tutorial on how to properly use manual mode. We will discuss the basics of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Let's begin. Locate your manual mode, indicated on most cameras with an M. If you're not shooting with a DSLR, I cannot guarantee that this tutorial will apply to your camera. I only know that these principles do universally apply to all DSLRs that use the same terminology. Locate how your camera adjusts its settings. If this is with a dial, indicated here, or with arrows and an OK or Set button, or a combination of both, it is generally a simple system. This is not a tutorial on how to navigate your camera. This is a tutorial on what shutter speed, aperture or f-stop, and ISO mean, and how you can control them in manual mode. I will be explaining shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. All of these control light levels, but they also control other aspects of your shot. Let's move on to shutter speed. Shutter speed is generally represented with a fraction to indicate the length of time the shutter is open. If the fraction is 1/4000, the shutter is open for 1/4000th of a second, a very small amount of time. If the shutter speed is 1/30, the shutter speed is 1/30th of a second, a comparably larger amount of time, and enough time to get motion blur with any moving subject. Cameras can capture much larger amounts of time. I have exposed one frame for a half an hour before. However, this was in an extremely dark situation, capturing light from stars. Shutter speed controls both light levels and motion blur. If you are capturing entirely still, unmoving subjects, you are free to control light levels with shutter speeds, because you can darken the environment by increasing the shutter's speed, causing the shutter to open and close faster, allowing less light in, or allow it to open and close slower, allowing more light in. With fast-moving subjects, such as in sports photography, you are forced to set your shutter speed either to 1/4000 or to somewhere near it if you want clear, quality shots. This would cause you to brighten your shots in other areas, which we will talk about in a few minutes. For newer photographers, unless you are using a tripod, I cannot recommend using a shutter speed slower than 1/125. Either your subject will unexpectedly move or you will, and it is just a safe shutter speed to stick with. It is light enough to work with in most light settings. If you are using a tripod, I can recommend experimenting with other shutter speed settings. In the near future, I hope to release a tutorial on how to capture the best long exposures of the night sky. Aperture, or f-stop as it is also referred to, controls light levels and depth of field. Aperture controls whether or not your photo has depth. It controls whether the focus of your image stands out or everything is in focus. Aperture is technically an opening in your lens through which light passes into your camera. It is critically important to realize this. A wide open or large aperture is indicated by a small number. A small or nearly closed aperture is indicated by a large number. Your aperture number, such as f1.8, inversely indicates what you would think. A small aperture number indicates a large amount of light. f1.8 is as bright as most lenses get, whereas f20 is as dark as most lenses would ever be used to shoot, except for extremely long exposures. That is not the most important part of aperture, though. The light is important, but more important is the depth of field. A small f-stop or aperture number indicates a narrow depth of field, and a large f-stop number indicates a large depth of field. If you are letting a large amount of light into your camera, you are only focusing on a very narrow depth or plane. If you are allowing very little light in, you can focus on almost everything, ideal for landscape photography, where you can take a picture from a mountaintop and have your friend, who is a few feet away, still in focus. To show you an ideal example of this, I'll use the rings on this notebook I have. In the two examples shown, you can clearly see the difference between a small aperture and a large aperture, a large f number and a small f number. Let's move on to ISO. So ISO is your camera's internal editor to brighten photos. The only thing that it affects is an image's quality and the level of light. The lower the number of ISO, the lower the level of light. So 100 ISO indicates a small amount of light, whereas 6400 ISO indicates a large amount of light on most cameras. On my camera, it is as bright as it gets. 100 ISO means your camera's internal editor is not increasing the photo's brightness at all. 200 ISO indicates that the photo is being brightened somewhat. 6400 ISO indicates that your camera's internal editor is working very hard to increase the picture's brightness and will end up with a grainy photo, just like any other editing program will if you brighten a photo too much. A safe zone for ISO on my camera, a Canon Rebel T3i, which admittedly is an older camera, is between 100 and 800 ISO. Occasionally I will use 1600 ISO, but the pictures do increase in graininess. They lose quality when I step up the ISO. At 800 ISO, I retain most of the quality. On newer cameras, it might be another step or two higher that you're able to go on ISO without losing that quality. You won't necessarily see that quality loss in the screen of the camera unless you zoom in on the picture. But if you zoom in on the picture, you can clearly see that there is grain and fuzziness to the pictures and you're losing quality. And if you use too much ISO in a dark environment, the overcompensated photo really lacks quality. So for any given photo, you must appropriately balance ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. The best way to determine what settings you have to use is to figure out what's most important. If you're taking a portrait, the most important setting is likely the aperture, because your subject is likely not moving. If you're taking sports photography, or photography of any moving subject, perhaps birds flying outside, or your dog running around your house, you might want a higher shutter speed and change your aperture to compensate. And your ISO is really just wiggle room. When you first begin to use manual mode, you will have to learn through trial and error what settings work in what scenarios. When I first learned in manual mode, I had to adjust settings many times before I got any picture right. And many of my pictures still turned out blurry or fuzzy, or I overcompensated with ISO, or my picture wasn't as clean as I wanted it to because I misused aperture, or they were too dark or they were too light. Even after taking pictures for as long as I have been, a couple of years, sometimes I still have to adjust settings a couple of times before I'm fully ready to get the perfect picture. Especially when light is changing or I'm going from one environment to another, sometimes I don't react as quickly as I should, just because I'm still learning. And I hope that I'm always learning, because there's always things to learn. There's always a new situation, a new scenario that you've never taken a picture during. There's new times to learn. Keep learning, keep developing, and I hope this was helpful.